So, I have finally read one of the most recommended spiritual books that has been sitting on my reading list for a while now. It's called The Three Waves of Volunteers and the New Earth by Dolores Cannon. And to be honest, I expected this book to be mostly about aliens and UFOs. And okay, yes, there are definitely aliens and UFOs in this book. However, there is something that I found much more philosophical underneath all of the ET stories and hypnosis sessions and discussions about different dimensions. And that's that this book is really about consciousness, emotional healing, fear, love, purpose, human evolution, and really what it means to be human during chaotic times. But whether you interpret this book literally, metaphorically, spiritually, or somewhere in between, it definitely gives you a lot to think about. And by the end of the book, it gave me a sense of preparedness that if something totally unexpected were to happen, that I'll have the sense to navigate any sort of chaos with courage and with love. So, with that in mind, I can absolutely see why this book resonates with so many people. For the first video in this series that I'm recording, I want to discuss kind of what this book is about, the core mechanics, and some of the ideas behind it, what stood out to me, what resonated, some things I'm still questioning, and why I think so many people feel so deeply connected to this material. So, this isn't going to be just a book review. It's more kind of like a deep dive into the material with some personal reflections on what did and didn't resonate. And I'd really love for this to become a conversation with all of you. So if you've read the book, or even if you haven't, I'd love to hear your interpretation in the comments. So, who is Dolores Cannon? Well, she was a hypnotherapist and author who became well known for her work in past life regression and consciousness exploration. So, over decades of her hypnosis sessions, she developed her own method she called QHHT, or Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. And throughout these sessions, the people, her clients, they would describe past lives, spiritual experiences, encounters with beings, multidimensional realities, and information coming from what she called the subconscious or higher consciousness. Now, obviously, none of this is scientifically proven, and I want to be very clear about my approach to this series. I'm not here to convince anyone that every single thing in this book is literally true. We don't have to blindly accept anything, but that doesn't mean that we immediately dismiss ideas that don't come from logic or reasoning. I find value in exploring ideas with an open mind while also staying grounded and thoughtful. So, whether you're someone that interprets all of this symbolically rather than literally, I think that there are still some really fascinating philosophical ideas in this book. Part of why I wanted to create this series is because I know a lot of people would probably never pick up a book like this on their own. Some of the concepts are definitely very far outside of mainstream thinking, but the actual hypnosis sessions themselves are really quite fascinating to read. Even when I don't fully know what I think about certain parts, I still find some discussions around consciousness, fear, emotional healing, purpose, human behavior, and human potential really interesting to explore. So, if anything in this video resonates with you, I'd actually recommend reading the book for yourself and forming your own interpretation from the source material directly, especially because I can only summarize so much in a video like this. Let's go ahead and get one of those more out there concepts out in the open. So, according to Dolores' hypnosis sessions, many extraterrestrial or higher dimensional beings became deeply concerned around the mid 1900s. So basically, humanity had reached a point where we had developed technology faster than consciousness. We saw the effects of war and man made destruction. We saw humanity's increasing ability to harm both ourselves and our Earth. It's not that humans are evil, it's just that we were immature with power, and still are, in my opinion. Dolores repeatedly says these extraterrestrial beings could not interfere directly because of our free will. So instead of coming down and controlling humanity from the outside, some supposedly chose to incarnate as humans and influence things from within. That's where this idea of the three waves of volunteers comes in. Souls coming into human lives to subtly help shift consciousness through compassion, healing, calmness, creativity, teaching, and emotional growth rather than force. Whether someone interprets that literally or symbolically, I think it's really interesting because it reframes change as something that happens from person to person internally first, rather than some external force of domination and control. So, what are the three waves of volunteers? This is basically the central premise of the book. And according to Dolores Cannon's hypnosis sessions, Earth is currently going through a major energetic consciousness shift. And some souls actually volunteered to incarnate here during this period to help humanity through this transition. And she refers to these souls as volunteers. The book divides them into three waves. The first wave are described as extremely sensitive souls that incarnated here from around the 1950s through the 1970s. Many supposedly struggled deeply with being human. They often felt homesick, emotionally overwhelmed, depressed, disconnected from society, or just simply exhausted by the heaviness of Earth. The book describes many of them as having difficulty understanding violence, greed, manipulation, cruelty, and just the heavy density of human emotions. And I think even if you don't believe anything else in the book, I think a lot of people can really relate to that feeling, especially if you're a highly sensitive person or if you're someone that feels emotionally drained by the overwhelm of modern life. The second wave. Oh, the second wave is really interesting. These people supposedly help more energetically than verbally. They may have incarnated anywhere from the 1970s to the 1990s, and the book repeatedly describes them as transmitters, beacons, stabilizers, people whose energy affects others simply by being present. And this is actually one of the biggest reacting themes throughout the book, that this sort of consciousness and emotional energy, that they are contagious. Your calmness affects people, just like fear affects people. Love affects people. Healing affects people. And for me, this resonates because even outside spiritually, we already know emotionally that this is true. You can walk into a room and feel tension. You can also feel safe around certain people. Some people regulate your nervous system just by being around them. And I think that's a really important conversation, regardless of how you're interpreting the book. The third wave refers mostly to newer generations of children. They're described as arriving already aligned with these newer energies and frequencies. Less karmic baggage, more intuitive, more naturally aware. And throughout the book, there's this recurring idea that humanity itself is evolving, not just technologically, but emotionally and spiritually. What really surprised me is that the core message isn't just that aliens are coming, but that humanity and specifically human consciousness is totally evolving. Some core themes that the book repeatedly comes back to include emotional healing, heart-centered living, fear versus love, compassion, nervous system regulation, peace, and interconnectedness. And this could be why Dolores' book has become so influential. It was published back in 2011, yet the messages resonate now more than ever. I think even when the book was first published, a lot of people were feeling disconnected, overstimulated, emotionally exhausted, lost spiritually, isolated, anxious, and frankly, we are burned out. This book gives people a framework for understanding why you might be feeling that way, as well as understanding your purpose and how to prepare. Now, whether this framework is literally true, symbolically, or psychologically true, That's kind of where your personal interpretation comes in, especially once we get into the really controversial stuff. This book contains a lot of material about extraterrestrials, light beings, multidimensional consciousness, implants, ships, councils, energetic beings, and completely different civilizations. Frankly, some of the stories of these past life regression hypnotherapy sessions are really wild. But something that I noticed is that the ET material often functions more like a framework for discussing consciousness and evolution more than just aliens from outer space. Many of the ETs that they described in the book, they're talking about unity, emotional evolution, consciousness, healing, and interconnectedness. So, on the one hand, you might interpret these stories literally, but I do understand that some others are interpreting this more symbolically, like as a metaphor for higher consciousness, intuition, or a sense of collective awakening. I don't know that I take everything in this section literally. There are a lot of parts that for me does feel deeply symbolic, and then there's other parts where I genuinely don't know what to think. But I continue to stay open-minded without abandoning discernment, and I think that that's really important. One theme that did stand out to me personally, the book repeatedly says that one of the most important things that we can do is simply to live, to love, to heal, and to learn to be happy. And that sounds simple, but simple doesn't mean easy, especially when free will of humans is involved. I think a lot of us were conditioned to believe that happiness only exists in this distant future somewhere. Like, I'll be happy when I lose the weight, or I hit this certain milestone, or I make lots of money, or achieve a certain goal, or find my perfect match. But sometimes we can still feel empty even after we've achieved a certain milestone that we thought we needed achieved in order to be happy. So this book made me really reflect on what actually creates happiness. What creates peace internally? How much of our suffering is actually coming from fear or emotional conditioning or just living in survival mode? And lately, I've really committed to myself to not allowing external things to completely dysregulate my nervous system. Not because these difficult things don't matter, but because I am working to be more grounded internally. And I thought it was really interesting. This book talks a lot about internal peace and how calm people become stabilizing energies during chaotic times. A calm person can absolutely affect the environment around them, the energy of the room, and the people that are around them. I've talked in previous videos about how our personal energy affects not only the people around us, but also the world around us. Another thing that I found really interesting is that this book talks constantly about raising vibration and raising the frequency. And I think that this phrase gets misunderstood sometimes. You might hear high vibration and immediately think that that means they're telling you to be love and light positivity 24/7. But I personally feel that raising your vibration is actually about healing emotionally, regulating our nervous system, becoming more conscious, more compassionate, letting go of self-destructive patterns, and learning how to create your own internal peace. That interpretation feels really grounded, and you don't even have to believe in aliens. So, what do I personally think so far? This book is fascinating. Look, there's some really far out there concepts, but there's also a lot of concepts that are very grounded in reality and things that we can do now to prepare ourselves for whatever comes next. We don't have to know everything. And as I was reading this book, I found myself imagining what it could be like if everything was happening exactly how the book laid out. So that would mean that ETs are real. Not only that, they are us and we are them. ETs are always watching over us in the background, but that certain souls basically volunteered to incarnate here and influence our world from within. Does that make me a volunteer? I was born in the 80s, so does that make me a second wave volunteer? And how exciting it must be that my soul chose to incarnate during one of the biggest consciousness shifts that has ever happened. And if that's the case, this would be the first time ever that an entire planet has shifted consciousness. Not just in our universe, but across all universes. Okay, but all woo-woo aside, underneath discussions about UFOs and dimensions, this book is still asking some incredibly human questions like, why are we here? Why is humanity struggling? Can consciousness evolve? What is the part that emotional healing has in all of this? How is fear influencing society? Can we affect each other energetically? And what would a more conscious humanity look like? So whether the volunteers are literal or symbolic, the message keeps coming back to healing, compassion, awareness, emotional growth, and learning how to live from love instead of fear. And I think that we can all agree that what the world needs now is love, sweet love, not just for some, but for everyone. In the next video, I'll dive deeper into the characteristics of the different three waves, and I'm going to tell you about a fourth group of volunteers who are far less common, only 10,000 souls. Dolores refers to them as the keepers of the grid. And then in some other videos, I also want to explore this connection that the book makes between consciousness, energy, ETs, and this whole idea of a new Earth. So if you want to follow along with the series, I invite you to subscribe and to set your bell to all, and that way you will get notified. What do you think this book is really about? And does anything that Dolores has gathered from her hypnotherapy sessions make any sense at all? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you at the next video.